There was a Tuesday morning, completely ordinary, when I realized I had no idea why I did half the things I did. Not in a scary way. More like that moment when you're driving somewhere familiar and suddenly think, wait, did I actually stop at that light? You were on autopilot. You just didn't know it until right then. That realization didn't come from a therapy session or a self-help book. It came from watching my coworker Marcus eat lunch alone for the third week in a row, and noticing that I had been deliberately choosing a different table every single day, not because I disliked him, but because something about him made me uncomfortable in a way I couldn't name. I sat with that for a long time. I was 34, working as a project manager at a mid-sized logistics company in Cincinnati. The kind of job where you know everyone's name, you have an opinion about the coffee machine, and you believe, genuinely believe, that you're a pretty self-aware person. I thought of myself as someone who treated people fairly. I didn't yell. I didn't gossip. I showed up on time and listened when people talked. By any reasonable standard, I was decent. Considerate, even. Marcus had joined our team about a month earlier. He was quiet. Not unfriendly, just contained. He did his work well, answered questions directly, and never stayed for the little Friday afternoon conversations that most of us lingered around. He wasn't cold. He was just not available in the way most people were. I remember thinking he probably just needed time to warm up. That's what I told myself. New job, new city, introvert. Totally understandable. But somewhere underneath that generous interpretation, there was something else. A low, quiet hum of discomfort that I never examined too closely. The thing I noticed first wasn't anything dramatic. It was small. Almost invisible. Whenever Marcus spoke in a meeting, and he didn't speak often, I found myself listening for the ending of his sentences a beat too early. Like I'd already decided what he was going to say before he finished saying it. And then when he said something different, something thoughtful and specific that I hadn't anticipated, I'd feel this strange internal delay. Like my brain had to load the actual version of him instead of the one it had already prepared. I didn't think much of it at the time. I figured it was just the natural awkwardness of a new team dynamic. Then one afternoon, our manager Sandra pulled me aside. She mentioned that a few people had commented that Marcus seemed disconnected from the group. She asked if I'd noticed anything. I told her what I honestly believed, that he was probably just adjusting, that he'd come around. She nodded, thanked me, and moved on. But that evening on the drive home, something she said kept circling back. She'd used the word disconnected. And I kept thinking, disconnected from what, exactly? From us? Or were we disconnected from him? It was the first time I'd considered that the distance might not be coming only from his side. The following Monday, I made a decision that felt small at the time but turned out to be one of the more important things I'd done in years. I sat down next to Marcus at lunch. Not to fix anything. Not because Sandra had prompted me to. I just decided, almost on impulse, that I was going to stop treating his silence like a wall and try treating it like a door. We talked for about 20 minutes. He told me he'd moved from Portland after a long stretch of caregiving for his father, who had passed away 8 months earlier. He'd taken the job here because he needed a new start, somewhere that didn't carry the weight of everything he'd been through. He wasn't cold. He wasn't difficult. He was someone who had been living inside a grief so familiar to him by now that he didn't think to announce it anymore. I drove home that evening and sat in my car in the driveway for a few minutes longer than usual. Not because the conversation had been profound in any theatrical way, but because I kept replaying every moment over the past month when I'd registered his quietness as something slightly off. Something that needed explaining. Something that, and this is the part that bothered me, felt like a mild warning. I had been treating a grieving man's stillness as a social red flag. And the worst part wasn't that I'd done it. The worst part was that I hadn't even known I was doing it. That's when I started paying attention differently. Not to Marcus, specifically, but to myself. To the invisible machinery running just underneath my conscious choices. I started noticing that I had a very specific comfort zone when it came to people, and it had almost nothing to do with whether they were good or kind or interesting. It had to do with whether they fit a certain pattern of social behavior that I'd grown up equating with safety. Eye contact at the right moments. Reciprocal small talk. A certain rhythm of openness. People who matched that rhythm felt easy to me. Familiar. Trustworthy, almost automatically. People who didn't, like Marcus, triggered something in me that I had always mistaken for discernment. For good judgment. But it wasn't judgment. It was pattern recognition. And patterns aren't the same as truth. I thought about how many people I had quietly kept at arm's length over the years. Not because they had done anything. Not because I had any real reason. But because they moved through the world a little differently than I expected, and I had let that difference become a story about who they were. The introvert I'd assumed was arrogant. The coworker who never laughed at group jokes, who I'd figured was unfriendly, until I learned she was navigating a custody battle and barely sleeping. The neighbor I'd avoided for 2 years because he never waved back, and then one day I found out he had a hearing impairment. I hadn't been cruel to any of these people. I hadn't been unkind. But I had been quietly, automatically, completely wrong about them. There's a term in psychology, schema. It refers to the mental frameworks we build from experience to help us process the world faster. They develop early. They're useful. They help us navigate without having to analyze every single thing from scratch. But schemas don't just organize information. They filter it. They tell you what to pay attention to and what to ignore. And over time, they start to feel less like tools and more like facts. I had a schema for trustworthy person. One for difficult person. One for someone I don't need to know better. And those schemas had been doing a lot of work on my behalf, making decisions, shaping perceptions, keeping certain people close and others at a careful distance, without ever asking my permission. I wasn't running my social life. My patterns were. And the unsettling part was that none of it had ever felt like a choice. It had all felt like instinct. Like I was just reading people accurately. I didn't have a dramatic conversation with Marcus after that. I didn't apologize, because an apology would have required explaining something he had no idea was happening. We just started sitting together at lunch more often. We talked about ordinary things, the city, the work, sometimes his father, sometimes nothing in particular. He became one of the more interesting people in my life that year. Thoughtful in a way that took time to access. The kind of person you had to be patient enough to actually meet. And I kept thinking about how close I'd come to never knowing that. How easily I could have gone the entire year keeping a polite, comfortable distance, and filed him away in some category that had nothing to do with who he actually was. The thought stayed with me. Here's what I've come to understand, not as a conclusion, but as something I'm still working with. Most of us don't choose how we respond to people. Not really. We respond from a history we've mostly forgotten, using patterns we never consciously designed. The emotional reactions that feel like judgment are often just echoes. Old software running on new situations. The part that requires actual effort, actual intention, is the pause. That small space between the feeling and the decision. The moment where you notice that you've already made up your mind about someone and you ask yourself, based on what, exactly? Not every instinct is wrong. Some patterns are worth keeping. But the ones we never examine are the ones that do the most damage, quietly, invisibly, over years. Marcus left the company the following spring. Better opportunity, different city. We said goodbye in the parking lot on a Friday afternoon, The kind of goodbye that feels simple on the surface but carries more weight than either person says out loud. On the drive home, I found myself thinking about all the people I would meet in the coming years. All the first impressions. All the quick reads. All the moments where some low hum of discomfort might rise up and I'd have to decide whether to listen to it or to question it. I don't think I'll always get it right. But I think I'll notice more. And I think that's the only place it can actually start.